So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I am Roy Holler, an assistant professor of Israel studies at the Center of Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. And the center is delighted to host Professor Dan Ben-David. This event has been literally years in the making, and I'm so glad that you are finally here with us. This is co-sponsored by Mr. Eli Glazer and the Jewish Council of North Florida, and of course the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. So I'm honored to introduce Professor Dan Ben-David, who holds a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago. He founded and heads the Shoresh Institution for Socioeconomic Research, and he is a senior faculty member in the Department of Public Policy at Tel-Aviv University. Professor Ben-David was actually named Person of the Year by Calcalist, a newspaper in Israel, and was included 3 times, most recently in 2019 in Haaretz-TheMarker newspaper's list of the 100 most influential people in Israel. He's also the former executive director of the Taub Center for Social Policy Studies, and he's really one of the 10 most cited economists in Israel, and amongst the 1,000 most cited academic economists in the world. So it's really an honor and a pleasure. Also with us is Cynthia Werslovsky, who is the Director of Strategic Partnership at the Shoresh Institution for Socioeconomic Research. So as a part of our series, as I mentioned before, Contemporary Israel and Its Challenges, which we are now hosting the last of the talks, Professor Ben-David will give a talk today titled Israel at a Crossroads, Directions, Perceptions, Illusions, and Challenges. Welcome, Professor Ben-David. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to say one more thing. We will all have the opportunity to ask Professor Ben-David questions after his presentation. You can go ahead and feel free to raise any questions you might have in the Q&A section that you will see at the bottom of your screen. I will moderate these questions. You can post them as you listen to the talk or after. I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion, as this is a very interesting topic that we have today. And that's it for me. Professor Ben-David, I will let you have the stage.
Thank you very much, Oyi, and thank you all for those who organized it, Norman, Randy, everyone who organized it, and of course, Eli Glazer, who initiated the whole thing. Much appreciated. Cynthia Werslovsky, my colleague, is also with us. She'll be talking a little bit later. She's in charge of our strategic partnerships at Shoresh. So let me, without further ado, share the screen here and get started. Okay, so I hope you only have one shot on the screen here rather than a million. I head the Shoresh Institution, as we said, and just to give you a little bit of a background what this is about. Israel is without a doubt the startup nation. We have some of the best universities in the world, a high-tech sector that's just phenomenal, it's cutting edge. But, and that's a big but, having said that, we are on trajectories, some of which I'm going to talk about today, that are simply unsustainable as a whole. And the sky won't fall tomorrow or the day after, but unsustainable means unsustainable. And there are some things that we need to take care of, and we need to take care of soon. Because we, a number of economists, I'm at Tel-Aviv University, my colleague who helped me found and establish a Shoresh Institution, Professor Eyal Kimchi from the Hebrew University. We're a number of economists that are very concerned about the future of Israel, and we decided to focus on the root causes of what's happening. Root in Hebrew means shoresh, hence the name of the institution, because a lot of the information that is being put out, not just on Israel, in general today, a lot of information is partial, often misleading. We jump to conclusions just on the basis of partial information, and again, not just in Israel, in other countries, on other issues. And what I'd like to do is to take you for a ride, just 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet, just look at where Israel was, where it is today, where we're headed, and basically the kind of crossroads that we're at. We're looking at some very major issues that need to be dealt with very soon. And so without further ado, let me just give you a little bit of a glimpse of where we're at right now. And one of the big things on the table right now is COVID. If we look at the total number of deaths per capita, in this case, per million people in the population, if we look at the entire OECD, all of the developed world countries are members of the OECD. Not all members of the OECD are developed. So take it with a grain of salt with regard to some of these countries, but definitely all the developed countries are in there. How do we stack up as of just a few days ago, 3 days ago, in terms of the number of people who have died relative to the size of the population? And we've actually done fairly well. The US is also on here, and you can see in relative terms, relative to country size, relative to population, how each of the countries is doing. And again, we're doing well. It's primarily because of basically phenomenal staff of physicians and nurses and so on, much less so the bureaucracy, but we'll get to that if we have time in a bit. The healthcare center in Israel, this healthcare center is responsible for a number of things. Among them, if you look at how infant mortality changed over the years, and as a benchmark, I'm showing you what happened in the OECD. The entire OECD is the orange, except for Israel and the US, which I'll highlight separately. And the green shows you basically the more developed world countries, which you can see infant mortality since 1970 has been across the board lower than the OECD in general. And that's because many countries in the OECDs are not developed. And this is when you add Israel and the US. And basically, if we compare to the primary developed world countries, you can see that we started off with much higher mortality rates in the past. The US was actually where the developed world was in the early 70s and all through the 70s pretty much. But something happened. We have moved below the US, and we are now basically at developed world levels in terms of infant mortality. The US is way above. And if we compare to the entire OECD, again, you can see where the two countries are compared to all the countries in the OECD. Life expectancy at birth. Here too, you can see what happened in the OECD, just the developed world countries or the entire OECD. Life expectancy across the world has been rising. And when we add the US and Israel, you can see basically a divergence. We all started in the same place with the developed world. Israel has pretty much maintained that, even a little bit above developed world in terms of life expectancy at birth. The US has been falling behind, and again, because of COVID, the last year is one for the history books in that case, and hopefully it won't repeat itself this year. Again, if we compare life expectancy to the entire OECD, you can see in general, last year in 2020, where the two countries stand compared to the other countries. So that is one way to look at a country, looking at quality of life in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality. And when we look at it this way, we look fine. The problem is it's not the only way. What about living standards? How do we measure living standards? The common way to measure living standards is output per capita, or GDP, per the number of people in society. And when we look at Israel's growth path, GDP per capita, since 1950, Israel was founded in 1948. The data was founded, a lot of cases, just in 1950. And you can see a very, very steady path, a very steep path. In the 50s, we were inundated with immigrants with just the clothes on their backs, and we actually had to ration food during this period in the 50s. We rebounded, we returned to the steady state path. Again, a very, very steady state path. That's what these growth paths tend to look like. Another major recession before the Six-Day War. The slope of the path reflects the rate of economic growth. So the steeper it is, the faster economic growth is. The year goes by, incomes rise. So if they rise by a lot, you get a steep path. This is one very, very steep path. We were very unique among nations. And if you compare Israel just to the countries that were similar to us in the early 1950s, 4 countries immediately above us in income standards and 4 immediately below, how fast did each of these countries grow in annual terms? Excuse me. And you can see that Israel grew much more quickly than the majority of countries in this case. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, we did not return to this path. This was a path that basically would have taken us to American living standards. That did not happen. What determines long-run paths are national priorities. Where does the money go? What kind of infrastructure, be it human capital, schools, what kind of schools do we have? Or physical infrastructure, such as roads, communications, and things of that nature. And what happened after the Yom Kippur War is Israel changed its national priorities. And it moved to another path, a much slower growth path. You can see it's much shallower than it was before, and very, very steady. It's though it's etched in stone. Even though during this period we underwent wars, triple-digit inflation, even hyperinflation during part of this period, aliyah, immigration to Israel to the tune of about 1/5 of the population within half a decade. So countries don't normally undergo even one of these. We underwent everything, and yet, as you can see, it's a very steady path. These are not the things that determine growth. And you can see here in the beginning of the 2000s, there was a big intifada. We had a major recession, incomes fell. And then when Israel gets its back to the wall, we do what we do, and we return to normal. But the normal is still a bad normal. We're falling further and further behind the developed world countries, the leading developed world countries. And if we compare again Israel to the 8 countries that were most similar to us in terms of income per capita in the early 70s, how fast did they grow and how fast did we grow? And you can see we moved down in the pack. We are now closer to the bottom than to the top. So what's the deal here? One of the things that matters is called productivity. And in fact, instead of looking at GDP per person, after all, not everyone works. Some are children, some are retirement age. It's more accurate to look at GDP per employed person, but some work full-time, some work part-time. The most accurate way of looking at things is the amount produced in a nation relative to the number of hours worked. That's called labor productivity. How much do we produce in an hour? And that's very much related to wages. You cannot give high wages if someone's not producing a lot. So on the horizontal axis, we have labor productivity. On the vertical axis, wages. What do the OECD countries look like? What's the relationship between productivity and wages? And you can see it's a very strong positive relationship. And in fact, Israel is below basically most of the developed world, or all of the really serious developed countries. The productivity is low, and as a result, wages are low. We cannot give high wages if we don't produce much. The problem is, not only is Israel's productivity low, here's the deal. When we narrow down and compare Israel just to the G7 countries, the leading developed world countries, US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, you can see that we've been falling further and further behind for the past almost half century, for the past 45 years, basically. The gap between these countries and Israel grew over threefold. And that has major, major ramifications, because when you have that kind of a situation, the bigger the gap between countries that we can move to and Israel, the more educated, the more skilled are going to find a greater incentive to move abroad rather than stay in Israel. And just to give you a sense of the emigration from Israel, if we look at all people who attained an academic degree in Israel between 1980 and 2010, 30 years, the Central Bureau of Statistics asked them where they are, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But before that, one thing that I forgot that's on here still is taxes. Not only is Israel falling further and further behind, if you look at direct taxes, income taxes, it turns out that already in the year 2000, half the population is so poor that the 5 lower deciles, the bottom 50% together paid only 1% of income tax. The top 2 income deciles, 20% of the population, footed the bill for 83% of all the income tax. And as we leave behind a greater and greater portion of the population, we are now at the point where the bottom 50% pay no income tax. They're so poor, they don't even reach the bottom rung of the income tax ladder. 92% of all income tax is just by the top 2 income deciles. The top 20%, which are primarily the more educated and more skilled, which brings me to the point that I thought that I was at earlier, which is the brain drain. If we look at all those who attained an academic degree in the 30-year period I said earlier, some leave Israel, some return to Israel. For every academic who returned to Israel, person with an academic degree, how many left? Well, in 2014, for everyone who returned, 2.8 left. By 2018, for every such person who returned, over 4 left. Again, the numbers are not high. The problem is the trend. We cannot keep falling further and further behind and hope to maintain a critical mass of the educated and skilled people who've basically been keeping Israel as a part of the developed world, which begs the question then, what's going on here? How come Israel, the startup nation with some of the best universities in the world, a cutting edge high-tech sector, how could it be that we're falling further and further behind? And the reason is that there are 2 Israels in one. There is the Israel of the universities and the high-tech and the biotech, which is indeed phenomenal, but there's another Israel. And that other Israel isn't receiving either the tools or the conditions to work in a modern economy, and that other Israel is simply huge. Not only is it big, but its share in the total is growing. It's like this huge weight. It's pulling down an entire country for almost half a century now. And this is not something that we can continue for another 4 decades. So that's what I meant when I said that we're on a track that's just simply unsustainable. So what are the things that are the primary determinants of productivity? Well, one of the major things is education. Where are we in terms of education? The share of Israelis with an academic education, with a tertiary education, we're ranked number 4 in the OECD, which for all practical purposes means number 4 in the entire world. We have a lot of people with an academic education. So on the face of it, we're super educated. The problem is that many of these degrees simply aren't worth the paper that they're written on. We have a problem with quality, less with quantity. We are a nation of shortcuts. So we just get the degree, it doesn't matter what you learn. A way to highlight this better is if we look, instead of academic education, average years of schooling per person on primary working age people. And here we're number 3 in the OECD. We study a lot. The people in Israel, on average, have more years of education than every country in the world except the US and Switzerland. But, and that's the big but, it's not the years in your education, but the quality of those years of education. To paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, what's the relationship between education and economic growth? So if we look at 50 countries over 40 years, and we begin with education quantity, the number of school years where we're actually pretty good at, versus economic growth, and you can see that basically there's not much of a relationship. There is a very slight positive relationship, but basically this just looks like a cloud. However, if we replace education quantity with education quality, what do the kids actually know in the basic subjects, in math, in science, and in reading? So there are international exams that are given, PISA, TIMSS, and so on. What do our kids actually know? And in fact, what is the relationship between what kids know and economic growth? And you can see that this is where the strong relationship is. It's a very strong relationship. What matters is not how many years it took you to learn the stuff, but what do you actually know? So how good is Israel's education system, not in terms of quantity of years, but in terms of what the kids actually know in math, science, and reading. So if we look at the most recent PISA exam, it's from 2018, and look at 25 developed world countries, basically the relevant group that we would want to compare Israel to. What is the average in science, math, and reading in each of these countries? And you have to wait a long time until you see us. Our children are basically at the bottom of the developed world. What you see here is essentially how each country is preparing its kids to deal with each other. And as you can see, we have a major problem. It's actually worse than what appears here on your screen, because it does not include the majority of Haredim, the majority of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, because they don't even study the material. The majority of them don't even study this stuff. So they don't take the exam. So we can't blame them on this result. Had they taken the exam, it would obviously been even worse. However, these people that were kind of sweeping under the rug and saying, well, we're looking at everybody else, they're not that important. Well, think again, the share of Haredim in each population cohort, in each age group, if we say every generation occurs every 25 years, what is their share in their age group? So at the oldest end of the spectrum, 95 years and up, the Haredim comprise 1.5% of that age group. You go down 25 years and you basically the upper 70s, mid to upper 70s, the Haredim comprise 3.3%. In other words, this doubles every generation almost. Go to the 50s and we're talking about Haredim being nearly 6% of that population group. The 20-year-olds are already at 14%, and when we're talking about toddlers or babies, they're already at 24%. This is what an exponential function looks like. We're going to talk about exponential functions later, because people have a tendency just not to understand how dangerous exponential functions are. You have a period of time where you can deal with things, and then they just blow up in your face. So this is a group that's not responsible for what you see here. Had they been taking the exam, it would be worse. But they're not studying material, they're not taking the exam. Who else do we have? We have basically 4 education streams in Israel. So aside from the Haredim, there are 3 left. The other 2 Jewish ones are the non-religious schools and the religious schools. The non-religious schools do okay. They are above the majority of countries, nothing to write home about. The religious schools in Israel are actually pretty bad. They're below the majority of developed world countries. And what kind of an education do we give the kids in the 4th stream, the Arabic speaking stream? That's with results basically below 3rd world countries. In other words, they live in the 1st world countries, but their net knowledge levels are like 3rd world. Now you can see the US isn't nothing to write home about. It's below the majority of countries. If we do a similar kind of an example of the US, divided up also into 4 groups, whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, what would that look like on the same graph? It would look like this. The Asians are literally off the graph. 549 is to the right of what appears here on the graph. The whites are basically receiving an education on average like the average Japanese or Korean. Hispanics are way, way down, although the average for Hispanics is still above Israel's average. Blacks attain an average below Israel, but above the Arab speakers in Israel, who themselves are above the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So it gives you a glimpse here of how this compares to other countries. In fact, if we compare the Arabic speakers in Israel, forget 1st world countries, compare them just to predominantly Muslim-speaking countries. There are 10 such countries that took this exam. Our children are below 9 of the 10 predominantly Muslim countries that participated in the exam. And when we look at the demography in Israel, this is 1st grade kids, 1st graders last year. This is the breakup where between a fifth and a quarter, 22%, are the Arab kids, Arabic-speaking kids who have achievements below many third world countries and below the majority of predominantly Muslim countries. And then we have another fifth, actually more than a fifth already, 21%, most of whom don't even study the material. Those two groups alone are nearly half the children of Israel. And then we have what we call the periphery, the Jewish social periphery or geographic periphery, development towns and so on, that comes from these two groups, the blue ones. In other words, roughly speaking, about half the children in Israel today are receiving a third world education, and they belong to the fastest growing population groups in the country. That is unsustainable because when they grow up, they will only be able to support a third world country. A third world country cannot support a first world healthcare system, a first world welfare system, but probably most important, given that we live in the most dangerous neighborhood on the planet, a third world economy cannot support a first world army, and we won't be able to defend ourselves. And that is already becoming an existential issue because we will not have the option, like other countries, of becoming a third world country. Lebanon, for example, once Beirut was referred to as the Paris of the Middle East, but they had a civil war, most of the educated people left, and now it's a third world country. But it remains, Israel will not remain as a third world country. That's the dangers that we're facing here. I want to focus a little bit more on the Haredim because they're not responsible for what I showed you up to now. However, we see a number of positive signs that lead many Israelis to the conclusion that, okay, things are turning around. You have to say that everything will be fine, as we say in Hebrew. Don't worry. One of the reasons is that an increasing number of Haredim is working and also going into higher education. However, that's misleading in a number of ways. One is because that's primarily the woman. The men, you have an increase, but it's not nearly the same. More important, to look at absolute numbers is totally irrelevant, especially when we're talking about Haredim, because the number of Haredim grew. So the denominator, you should have a denominator here. What is their percentage? More to the point is the fact that if you do not study a core curriculum as a kid, which is mandatory basically everywhere else in the developed world except in Israel, you're going to have an extremely difficult situation when you try to go to higher education. So even though they start off on the academic track, according to the numbers you see behind the insert here, their dropout rates are just phenomenal. Over half the women drop out, and over 3/4 of the men drop out. And keep in mind, we have a selection bias. These are the ones who actually want to study in higher education. And even though they want to, they simply don't have the tools. You cannot just skip grade school and high school and think that you're going to be able to overcome it later. You can't. And by the way, just as a point of reference, they're not flunking from the Technion or Hebrew University or Tel Aviv. They're not able to pass from some really, really crummy colleges. And yet, this is what it looks like. So if we compare, for example, not just the number of people who want to get a higher education, but the share of Haredim that actually do, and as a benchmark here, the secular Jews in Israel have the highest share of people with an academic education. And as you can see here, it's rising over time. It's higher for the women than for the men. What does it look like for the Haredim? So in recent years, it has begun to increase for women. For the men, nothing. For the past 15 years or so, they are not going anywhere. Again, they're not studying anything relevant for a higher education, for working in a modern economy. What kind of a hope do they have? Now, again, we're talking about a group that's growing exponentially fast. We can deal with the few adults that there are today that are Haredim. What are we going to do when basically they become a huge group? We'll talk about that, look at the numbers in a moment. But how important is just a basic education? In the States, where in most places it's mandatory to get the core education can differ from school district to school district. In many cases, the Hasidim try to get out of it, try to copy from our guys, but in general, they have to study. So when we compare Hasidim in America to Hasidim in Israel, ultra-Orthodox in America to ultra-Orthodox in Israel, what does it share with an academic degree? And you can see that when you have a good basic education or even some basic education versus none, the share of people with an academic degree is just double what it is in Israel. So what is the direction that Israel's headed? Are we becoming less religious or more religious? One of the studies that's being done annually by the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel is that they ask people, what are you today? Are you, if we look at for a moment just at the Jews, are you Hasidim, ultra-Orthodox? Are you religious, like modern Orthodox in the States? Are you traditional, Masorti? Or are you secular, non-religious? And not only what are you today, but what were you as when you were growing up? What were you when you were 15? So that way we can get an idea what people grew up as and what they are today. So if we start off with the Hasidim, the ultra-Orthodox, their attrition rate is very low. 88% of those who grew up Hasidim remain Hasidim. The other group and all the rest, 12% become less, be they religious, traditional or secular. At the other end, the group that maintains quite a few of its people the same way they grew up are the secular Jews in Israel. 84% of those who grew up secular remain secular. 13% become more religious in the way, in terms of they become traditional, and another 2% religious, 2% Hasidim. Who does not keep as many of their kids as adults in the same stream? The traditional Jews, only 2/3, just over 2/3, who grew up traditional remain traditional. Nearly a quarter become secular, and a few, 10%, become more religious. Who really has a problem keeping their kids as adults in the stream are the religious Jews. Only half of those who grew up religious remain religious. Only 6% become more religious, in other words, Hasidim, ultra-Orthodox. The remainder, a full third, become traditional. 9% go all the way and become secular. So on the face of it, it would appear that we're becoming less and less religious. By the way, the retention rates are relatively constant over the years. So you can see for the Hasidim and the secular Jews, it's been rising a bit. Same thing for the religious. So we're not talking about major changes here in terms of retention rates. So on the face of it, we seem to be becoming more or less and less religious, but that's misleading. Why is it misleading? Because we're leaving out a major factor, which are fertility rates. How many children does a family in each of these groups have? And as you can see, the Hasidim just swamp everybody else. They have 7.1 children per family. So even if, say, 20% were to leave, then we would lose 1.4. We would go from 7.1 to 5.7. It would still dwarf everything else. Israel, unless something happens, is going in the direction eventually of becoming more and more ultra-Orthodox, more and more Hasidim, and all of the attrition from the other groups really doesn't matter, given the high fertility rates here. If we look at fertility rates over time, and this time we'll include the Arab-speaking groups, the Muslims, the Christian Arabs, and the Druze here, then you can see that in 1980, there were basically two clusterings of fertility rates. A high cluster around 6 children per family, the Muslim, the Druze, and the Hasidim. And basically the more educated Israelis, the traditional or religious Jews, the Christian Arabs, who are much more educated than the Muslim Arabs, and the secular Jews. Now, how did this transpire over time? You can see that in general, fertility rates have been falling, not for all groups. For the religious groups, it's been rising in recent years, but basically returning to what it was in the 80s. Same thing with the secular Jews. It's been rising in recent years, but it's still roughly where it was in the 80s. Overall, fertility is dropping. except for one group. The Haredim were never in any government coalition until 1977. Since then, they've become basically the kingmakers in Israel. When the right doesn't want to sit with the left or the left doesn't want to sit with the right, who do they go to? The Haredim, basically. That's how they create governments in Israel pretty much ever since 1977. The Haredim don't really deal with the Palestinians or security issues. That's why they're an easy coalition partner. All you have to do is just give them money and let them run their schools and do whatever they want there. It's easy in the short term, but basically it's mortgaging their future and ours. When the money began to flow to the Haredim, look what happened to the fertility rates. So it's as though they're unrelated to the rest of Israeli society. In one decade, in the 1980s, the Haredim added a complete child to the family. In the 1990s, an additional half child. In other words, within just 2 decades, basically, they added 1.5 children to each Haredi family. In the early 2000s, we had the Intifada. You saw it in the GDP per capita graph, where incomes really plummeted here, buses blowing up all over the place. We were with our backs to the wall economically. We had to slash the budget. And when budgets were cut, benefits, social benefits were cut, and transfer payments, subsidies, and so on. And what happened as a result is that the Haredim, the money flow stopped, at least partially stopped, didn't completely stop to them. And you can see how it affected birth rates. But ever since they've been back in government, money's been flowing back, and they've been on their way up in terms of fertility rates, and they're higher now than 7 children per family in a Haredi family. So what's going on here in general? There are a number of issues that Israel needs to deal with. We touched upon the education system. I'll show you a little bit more about the education system in a moment, but there are other areas that we need to touch. We are very lax when it comes to enforcement, tax enforcement. So we have a huge shadow economy, but also you could see it in the COVID crisis. In fact, many of the long-term problems that Israel has, the shoresh, the root problems that we have that are going to explode in our face one day, we basically got a promo of this during the COVID in terms of how poor our education system is. It's basically dysfunctional, and it didn't know how to deal with COVID. The Haredim basically disregard every rule and regulation in Israel. So when we try to enforce all kinds of basically rules to keep people alive, they ignored them, and they died at rates that were basically double the rest of the population. They paid a huge price for ignoring the rules. Law enforcement, again, we didn't enforce the laws, not just on the Haredim, elsewhere as well. We pay a price. We have a very neglected transportation infrastructure. Healthcare is good when it comes to the individual, the doctors and the nurses and so on, who are really phenomenal, but the system itself has been struggling, to put it mildly. And so there are a host of issues here. I don't have time to go into all of them. I do want to touch upon at least one issue here, which is education. We touched upon it earlier. Fixing education doesn't mean just throwing more money at the problem if you don't deal with the root causes of what's going on. One of the primary problems, and that's in every country, not just in Israel, is that the child's achievement in school is highly dependent or highly linked to his mother's or his parents' education level, but more the mother than the father. And if we look at the countries with the best education systems, the country with the highest scores in PISA exam, you can see the link to the parents, to the mother here. What do we see on the graph? A child whose mother has no education or very, very low education levels, that child's achievement in core subjects is 6% below the benchmark child. Who's the benchmark child? That's a child whose mother just finished high school, that she has no education beyond high school. At the other end of the spectrum is a child whose mother has an academic degree. That child tends to do 6% better than the benchmark kid whose mom just finished high school and no more. So you can see that there are these gaps even in countries with good education systems. This is what it looks like in Israel. Our system is simply unable to deal with what's coming down the pike from home, basically. And again, this does not include the Haredim, who basically most of them are very, very uneducated. So it's an even more serious problem than what you see here. So what are the primary causes? Well, we have primary excuses, basically. One is that our classes are very congested. And now, research-wise, there's research that says that affects downward achievement. Others say it doesn't have an effect. I tend to believe actually it does have an effect. It doesn't matter what I believe. The number of kids per class in Israel is very high compared to the average in the OECD. More important, the question is, if the number of children per class is high, what is the number of children per teacher, full-time equivalent teacher? Well, in primary school, we actually have almost identical number of children per teacher as the OECD average. And in high school, junior high school and senior high school, we actually have less kids per teacher. So in other words, we pay for enough teachers, so what's the deal here? Why does this system continue to crowd our kids into classrooms? Another example of something that's given as a reason why our kids don't do well, they don't study enough, not enough instruction time. Well, if you look at all the OECD countries with data on instruction hours and also on achievement in these exams, you can see that the vast majority of countries teach less in a year than we teach in Israel. There are a few countries down at the bottom that teach more. The majority teach less, in some cases, much, much less. What do their achievement levels look like in math, science, and reading on average? And you can see that in each of these cases, they're higher. Not only are they higher, one of the most important things from this graph isn't even related directly to Israel. One of the most important takeaways is that it's not the country with the least number of instruction hours that has the lowest grades, and the country with the highest number of instruction hours with the highest grades. There's absolutely no relationship between them, because what matters is what exactly are the kids studying in school, and who's teaching them? How do we choose teachers, train them, compensate them? So let's go in the direction of teachers. Because when we look at the distribution of education students, the people who study education in Israel, over 3/4 study in what are called teaching colleges. Another 17% in general colleges, in other words, in non-research academic institutions, and only 4% study in the research universities. What does that mean? Well, we can look at their psychometric exam score. The psychometric exam in Israel is given to people before they go to college. Its function is identical to that of the SAT in the States. It's a screening exam. And the average grade on this exam is 624 for students who study at the university. Those who study education at the university, this sliver, this 4% here, their grades are much lower than the average university, but they look phenomenal compared to this group and this group. The people who study education in Israel at the university, their scores on this psychometric exam are 9% below the university average. in the non-research colleges, they're a quarter below or a third below. Now, again, we have people who can do anything. Not everyone is at that level. We have people who got accepted, actually had a career in some case, and choose to teach out of conviction. So we're not trying to wipe everybody in this color, but those are the exceptions to the rule. This is the rule in Israel. And the question is, how can we expect someone who themselves could not get accepted to university, to a research university in Israel, to bring our children up to that level? Maybe the reason is salary. That's one of the reasons that's often given. And if we look at the salaries in Israel, compared to the salaries in the OECD, in general, they are lower in Israel. This is the monthly salary. However, instead of looking at just what we pay, what do we get in return? How many hours of work do we get? So hours of work for a teacher is very difficult to estimate, because it's not just frontal teaching, it's also preparation and grading exams, so on. But assuming that that share of extra hours compared to the frontal teaching is roughly the same in all countries, what is the amount, what is the salary per teaching hour? Okay, so what does it look like in Israel compared to the OECD? And here's something else you need to take into account. Countries that are wealthier pay more to everyone, to engineers and to teachers. So you need to control for living standards in the country. So if we look at the average wage per work hour in Israel, in other words, normalize the teacher's salary per work hour by the average wage per work hour, and do the same thing in the OECD, what do our wages look like? And they're actually very high. In other words, we pay quite a bit to the teachers. Apparently, the problem is they don't work very much. And again, that's apparently why the classes are also crowded. One last note in this regard, the level of teachers in Israel, the PISA exams look at the knowledge level of children, of pupils. There's a similar exam that's called PIAC, which is given to adults, which is really low level, and yet it's illustrative of the situation in Israel. What is the level of knowledge of the teachers who deal with literacy skills, reading and so on, and of numerous math teachers, basically? And what you can see in the OECD is that the countries with good teachers in one realm have good teachers in the other realm. Where are we in this case? Our teachers are next to the bottom, we're just above Italy in terms of their knowledge level in literacy skills, and they're at the dead last of the developed world in terms of math teachers, what math teachers actually know in math. So we have our work cut out for us in this regard. So if we look at the bigger picture here, because I don't want to give you the impression that it's all down the drain. If I thought it was, I wouldn't live in Israel. I don't think so. I think we have a chance here. And I'd like to quote one of our foreign ministers, a famous foreign minister in the 60s and early 70s, Abba Eban, who said, "Men and nations behave wisely once they've exhausted all of the alternatives." And that's us. Once our back is to the wall, we end up doing the right thing. The point is to recognize that we have now an opportunity to deal with things that are going to blow up in our face at one point. What's going in our favor? I told you that our universities are very good. Well, if we look at our ranking, Israel compared to all the other countries in the world, this is a study done in the Technion by Professor Uri Kirsch, and he compared all the countries in the world in the fields that you see in front of you in terms of academic excellence. How do we measure academic excellence? He looked at the number of citations per article and compared in each field Israel to all of the other countries, and this is our ranking. So even though we still have a brain drain that's increasing over the years, we haven't lost a critical mass yet. We're still really good. We're ranked very high among all countries in the world in some of the areas that are most important for development. We invest a huge amount in R&D. The number of patents relative to country size in Israel, relative to GDP. And if we compare Israel to the G7, you can see that we've actually surpassed the developed world countries over a quarter century ago, and we remain up there. When you have a lot of innovation, it attracts a lot of money. Foreign direct investment, venture capital, for example, as a share of GDP. Israel and the US are just like off the charts here. You have to shrink the entire graph to get us into here. We're a multiple of every other country on this graph. So we have the knowledge, we have the innovation still. Money is flowing into Israel. This isn't people who are feeling sorry for us. This is serious people investing serious money, a lot of serious money in Israel because they believe that we have an opportunity here. So if we bring together what I told you earlier, two countries in one, it really comes to light in this graph here. If we look at all the countries in the world with at least 1 million people in them, on the horizontal axis, fertility rates, on the vertical axis, basically living standards, GDP per capita. If we group together just the high-income countries, those with at least $40,000 per person, you can see, first of all, that there are big gaps between them, but relatively low fertility rates. The next group is the group of countries between $20,000 and $40,000 per person. And here you can see there are already a number of countries with relatively high fertility rates. However, and this is the big however, there is a place where everyone can fall to, and that's the third world. That group is huge. It's like 4 times each of the other groups, okay? And they are really, really poor countries with a lot of kids. And you ask yourself, where is Israel? Who do we belong to? We don't belong to any group. We're out in the cold still, and we haven't decided who we want to belong to. If you look up here, that's the US, okay? And if you drive a line from the US through Israel, you reach Burundi. That's the poorest country on this graph. We're like a weighted average of the first world and the third world. We have the first world in Israel, but we also have the third world in Israel. And the question is, which one are we going to let win out here? Because the current default is to become third world. We're not giving the education that so many of our kids need. And that's basically affecting the fertility rates. I want to give you an example. One of the problems that we economists have is explaining to people how exponential functions work, because they're really misleading when it comes to policy. So time out from policy for a moment. Say we want to fill up 1 liter of water, okay? We use liters in Israel and Europe and so on. It's roughly 1/4 gallon for those who are unfamiliar with liters. In 1 liter, there are 1,000 milliliters, okay? Suppose in this bottle, we put 1/1000th of a millimeter, okay, of water in that 1 liter tube, okay? Just 1/1000th of 1 millimeter. And suppose that we double the amount every period, right? So what that means is that after 10 periods, we go from 1/1000th of a millimeter to 1/2 millimeter, okay? Again, we need 1,000 to fill up the bottle. So how many periods will it take to fill up the bottle with 1,000 millimeters? In other words, we need to have 1 million times this initial amount here to get to a liter, okay? So it took 10 periods to go from 1/1000th of a millimeter to 1/2 millimeter. But it takes only 5 periods now to go from 1/2 millimeter to 16 millimeters. In another 5 periods, we're already from 15 millimeters to 1/2 liter to 500 millimeters. So how many additional periods do we need to go from 1/2 bottle to 1 full bottle? Just 1 period. That's what an exponential function looks like. And a takeaway from something I saw on Twitter several months ago, the context here is different, but here's the problem that we have explaining this to a large part of the population and to a large part of the policymakers, okay? People don't make a distinction between levels and rates of change, okay? So at the beginning of the issue, this is how it's viewed. It's low, it's not a problem. Don't worry, what are you making such a fuss about? Economists say, but it's exponential growth. This is a period where we have many periods to deal with the problem, but you need to deal with the problem because it's going to get worse very quickly. We are now in Israel at a point where we see the problem, and we saw it during COVID. We see the problem rearing its head. And then that's how people basically understand there is a problem, okay? That's what exponential growth looks like. The problem is that not enough people understand it. So if we look at Israel in a nutshell, this is the graph that basically, this is our DNA graph. Everything that's really bad in Israel, everything that's really good in Israel in one graph, okay? In the PISA exams, they not only test the children and see what do they actually know in math, science, and reading, they also want to know what kind of self-confidence they have. They ask the children, do you understand even the most difficult material in math? And this is the share of children that says that they do understand. Okay, and what you can see is basically that we're delusional. You can see at the bottom here, Korea and Japan, they actually know the material, but they're not sure that they know the material. Who's up here at the top? You guys and us, okay? When you guys aren't doing so well, we do even worse. So here's the deal. I mean, we have this, well, Americans know how to package things. So, you know, it's called the CanDo Spirit, right? We, on the other hand, we're very arrogant. We say we know everything. We can't learn anything from anybody. Who are you to tell me what I need to do? That's the bad side of this. The good side of this is we are not afraid of anything. We're not afraid to try things. We're not afraid to fail. We may not necessarily decide to take the time to learn from our failure. That's a different issue. But imagine if these children with a high self-confidence in the developed world actually knew the material. Where would we be? The sky's the limit here. So to wrap things up, there is a democratic point of no return where things that are already very difficult to implement in Israel will become impossible to implement. We won't be able to pass them into Knesset. Having said that, the very, very bad year that we had, the year and a half, almost 2 years now, of COVID basically highlighted a lot of the things that are simply dysfunctional in Israel. We got a promo of the movie. And if we don't like the promo, we don't want to see that movie, this is the time to change. And we actually did something to change it. We had the most recent election, we had 4 in a row over the span of 2 years. The most recent election brought to government probably the most unique government in Israel's history, one that can actually make history. There are right-wing and left-wing, religious, secular, Arabs and Jews. They can actually initiate change here for all of the right reasons, because they can't come together on the things that basically have driven governments apart in the past. So who are these new leaders? And do they know the stuff that I just showed you here? Well, the prime minister today is Naftali Bennett. We've met him a few times. In 2015, we basically sat Shoresh Research and him. He was the Minister of Education. And we showed him, among other things, the state of education in Israel, some things that I showed you here, but something else in addition. It had to do with quality of education in math. Because at 5 units of math, that's the highest level of math in Israel, we witnessed just a free fall in the share of 12th graders studying math at the highest level. The parents were telling the kids, if you're having trouble at 5 units, go to 4 and get high grades. Why do you need to struggle and get low grades? The schools who are competing with one another are telling the kids the same thing. We want to show that our system is good, our school is good. So if you're having a problem, just go to a lower level and don't ruin our average. So everybody's telling these kids to dumb down. But here's the thing. When in the study that we did, if you look at the level of math that they studied in high school, and what is their wages a dozen years later, hourly wages, what you can see here is that the kids who are flunking at 5 units were basically earning the same as those who are excelling at 4. Those who are flunking or barely passing at 4 were earning the same as those who were excelling at 3. And we were showing this to the education minister. And when we reached this specific graph, he stopped us. And he started his own video. This is Bennett, showing this same graph to teachers and principals and parents, why the kids need to study at higher levels of math. And they went on a nationwide campaign to convince the children to study at higher levels. And you can make a difference with policy, and it worked, and it started to go up. Of course, the message was, you need to reform the entire system. This is what he focused on, but that's also good. Today, this man is our prime minister. Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid, we've sat with him many times. We've shown him the material. Everything I showed you and a lot more, we showed him. And he did a TED Talk. All these graphs that you see here are a half-hour TED Talk by Yair Lapid based on our material. Today, he's the alternate prime minister and the foreign minister of Israel. He's basically the one who pulled together this entire government and made it happen. But those are the two leaders, and the most important person in terms of money is the finance minister, Avigdor Lieberman. And he too, everything that I showed you, we've shown him. And basically we've shown this in the Knesset to the other ministers as well. So this is not something that's foreign to them. They just need to get their act together and start dealing with these issues. So everything I've shown you here appears on our website in a number of forms. It's in publications, and much more, by the way. It's in publications. It's also, we have something called a graph gallery with hundreds, literally hundreds of graphs by a dozen different designations. So feel free, go on the site, shoresh.institute, take a look around and get a feel for a lot more than what I just showed you here. And I'd like to pass the baton now to my colleague, Cynthia Roslavsky. Take it away, Cynthia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. And before we move on to Q&A, I just want to take a moment to express our gratitude to our partners and hosts who helped make this program possible today. The Jewish Council for North Central Florida, under the leadership of Virginia Hershik, and the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida, Director Dr. Norman Goda and Dr. Roy Huller, and Mr. Eli Glazer, our dear friend and supporter. So thank you. The Shoresh Institution is an independent research policy center. We're the only Israeli think tank focusing solely on Israel's primary existential socioeconomic challenges. By providing evidence-based and nonpartisan analyses to Israel's leaders and the public, our aim is to help shape national policy to ensure a sustainable future and more equitable future for all of Israel's citizens. Shoresh does not receive funding from any government, not Israeli government, nor governments abroad. Our funding comes primarily from independent partners. So if you appreciate our work and the presentation introducing you to our work made by Professor Ben-David today, I invite you to join our circle of supporters and make a donation. All donations to Shoresh are tax deductible, and we have a credit card option as well. I will be placing in the chat later on the links to our website and invite you to look for the information on our donate page. We also invite you to visit our, sorry, I'm just trying to share my, share my screen. Take a second. Trouble with this. Our contact page on our website has information for signing up to receive updates on our work, and you can also. Would you like me to put it up? Oh, please go ahead, Donnie. Yeah, I'm just not doing well with that today. So our contact page has an opportunity for you to sign up to receive updates on our work, and also to invite a Shoresh worker, researcher to come and speak at an event of your own. We also have the opportunity to order some of our materials or ask any other questions. So please do join us and link on to our contact page. And lastly, I just want you to know that I will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar with the links to our materials, our publications, our graphs gallery, our videos that are all available on our website. And we encourage you to share this information and use it, of course, with proper accreditation, but please use it and share it with other people. Our goal is to get word out on this material to as many people who care about Israel's future as possible. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll move on to Q&A right now.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you so much, Professor Ben-David. We already have a few questions on the Q&A board. I also encourage all the participants to post any questions that you have over there on the board. It is on your right lower end of the Zoom window. As the moderator, I'll take the opportunity to ask the first question, Professor Ben David, if you don't mind. It looks like the biggest flag that you're raising, or one of the biggest flags, is the Haredi population, right? That they don't study the core curriculum, that they are behind the rest of Israel and the Western world with high birth rates, low to no wages. That they need to catch up with the rest, or suffer, or that everyone will suffer, right? So I think that there's perhaps two issues here. First, I mean, at least on the outside, it doesn't really seem, they don't really seem to care, right? This is what me as a bystander, for me as a bystander, and two, that well, I guess it has also everything to do with number one, that they're not doing too well for a long time, and specifically now economically, and in the past year and a half, they were the population that was hit hardest by COVID. And they don't do much to prevent it, right? So in a sense, it's not about facts with the Haredi, right? It's about belief. So these graphs that you're showing, are great and are very informative. But how do you move such a population that doesn't necessarily, right, take their words from statistics, right, and from knowledge, but a different form of knowledge, of higher knowledge?
To be honest, I think it has nothing to do with beliefs. I think it has everything to do with power. The wish of their leaders, the Haredi leaders, to remain in power. And they took a page out of American politics: keep them barefoot and pregnant. That's the way to go. So keep them illiterate. I mean, the Rambam, the Maimonides, he was a doctor. The Lubavitcher rabbi, he studied in the Sorbonne in the University of Paris. He's a chemical engineer. Okay, it's not that this is foreign to Haredim. This is foreign to Israeli Haredim because their leaders do not want them to have the ability to decide on their own what's good for them and to make decisions. And they keep them captive basically by feeding them in an education system that just is locked out from the rest of the world. So when you have COVID, for example, okay, it has nothing to do with beliefs, how they behave. Basically, they're told it's no problem. Go open the schools. The rest of the country closing the school. Go and open the schools. What's the big deal here, right? But they're not able to get. They don't understand science, okay, because they don't study science. So what does a virus even look like? How does it behave? How does it expand? They don't understand math, exponential functions, that if I infect two people and each one infects two people, this thing is going to grow like wildfire. And they don't know English. So what's the deal with English, by the way? What language do Haredim in America speak, right? Has nothing to do with religion, what's going on there. But because they don't know English, they can't go on a website, they can't search for things on their own. What is happening here is simply a power grab by a number of leaders who want to do anything and literally sacrifice their own people to make sure they stay in power. And we enable it. Our leaders, Netanyahu called them the natural partners. Well, this is not natural. They're first of all hurting themselves, but given that the fact that they're growing at such an exponential rate, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics, half the children in Israel in just a generation and a half, in 44 years, will be Haredim. Like, we can right now take care of that population, even if they don't work, because they're small. They're not that many adults. But what's going to happen when instead of 8%, 9% of the adults are Haredim, they become 20% and half of the adults? Who's going to take care of them? Who among our children is going to remain in Israel? I mean, you already saw what the income tax is looking like. Like 20% of the population is footing over 90% of the income tax. So there's an issue here that they can decide whatever they want, okay? I don't really care, as long as it doesn't bring them down, and more important, it doesn't bring us down. Right now, we're on a path where this thing is just going to collapse on everybody's head here. So with all due respect to them, it has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with us. You guys need to study important stuff. Remain Haredim. I don't care. I have no problem with people being Haredim. You have to have the ability to become a physician, an engineer, whatever you want, just like in America, just like in any other country. And that's something that needs to be said. Otherwise, this becomes an existential issue for them and for us.
So why is the legislative focus, or you know, what you hear at the media at least, is about drafting of Haretis, right, to the IDF? I mean, it doesn't seem like you hear a lot about the educational issues, right, in the Haredi population.
No, because no one wants to touch that, because it's like a prisoner's dilemma, basically. Okay, if I'm going to enforce or change your school system, then after the next election, they're going to shun me and I will never be in power again, okay? And if I want to deal with, even if they're not in power now, they're going to be in power again, because I don't want to work with the right, or I don't want to work with the left, okay? So who else is left? It's just the Haredim. So I'm not going to screw them over right now, because it's more important for me to be in power than to save the country. I'm being facetious here, but basically that's the behavior that's been leading Israel for decades here. And right now, we have this magic opportunity, basically, where they're not in power, and right wing and left wing are both together. So you guys fix this and change the system so that they will not have that power anymore, and write a constitution, for God's sake, so that it'll be difficult to move us off track again in the future. Basically, adopt a system, a democratic system from other countries. I'm not a professional in this case, but what we have right now is completely dysfunctional. There's no checks and balances. We need checks and balances. We also need to separate the executive from the legislative, and we need an executive that can actually enforce things and remain in power and do the right thing, and have a little bit of an ability to look ahead 4 or 5 years without having to worry that the whole thing is going to tumble down within months if they can't get it together and can't get a coalition. So in my opinion, it has to do with politicians that need to come together. Again, that just happened. I mean, it actually literally just happened. And we have people, by the way, who do not stand a chance of becoming prime minister again in the current system. So change the system. If each one of you thinks that he's caliber of prime minister, fix the system, you know, so that you actually, one of you guys will be able to govern in the future.
Thanks. So I guess let me ask a question that popped up on Q&A, and I think it's sort of a good one to continue with. It's so Rick Gold asks, in education, Israel appears to have a major problem of separate but unequal schools. Are there efforts to seek court intervention similar to the Brown versus Board of Education case in the U.S.? That's Rick's question, but I think it's very important, especially with you know, now that the Israeli Arabs also have a more mainstream chunk of the Israeli parliament. What steps are kind of happening to better integrate schools, or to?
I think it's an important question. Well, we spoke at length about the Haredim. In the case of the Arabs in Israel, again, you have to distinguish the Christian Arabs and the Muslims. The Christians are a really tiny group, but they're relatively more educated. They're relatively educated, in fact. The Muslims are relatively uneducated, and they're huge, a huge group or a huge share of the Arabs. But in contrast to the Haredim, they actually want a good education. In fact, you can see it to the extent where the Haredim, the Muslims in Israel, on the one hand, are becoming more fundamentalist, more religious, but they understand the importance of education, and they send their kids to the private Christian schools with crosses all over the place, just so they get a good education. That's the only thing that matters for a growing Muslim middle class. And that's something that's on us. I mean, we can help out here. We should help out. We must help out, and basically give them, again, not just throw money at the problem, identify what are the main problems in these schools and fix them. But you could see in the fertility rates of the Muslims that are dropping, is because you have an increasing middle class that's more and more educated. Still not very well educated in absolute terms, but in relative terms, much, much more educated than their parents, and improving with time. And that's on us. We need to basically help them get educated, and that affects fertility rates.
Thanks. Thank you. Again, I encourage everybody to post any questions that they may have on the Q&A section. Let me ask another question that came up on the chat by Lynn Holt. Has there been a concentrated and organized effort to interview Israelis who leave Israel to live in another country to see why they had left, right? Speaking of the brain drain. So maybe the responses gleaned from those interviews can convince political leaders that they need to make fundamental reforms. Did the Shoresh Institute reach out, or do you have any information to support this?
We the Shoresh Institution have not. I mean, we just look at the dry facts and analyze them. But when we did a major study on the brain drain. I did ask university presidents in Israel and provosts and so on and deans, and at least in terms of the university professors, the answer differs from discipline to discipline. In some of the disciplines, for example, where the private sector pays a huge amount of money, computer science, electrical engineering, aeronautical engineering, finance, marketing, economics, the huge gap in the private sector between those fields and other fields forces American universities to pay high salaries in these fields. So they don't pay high salaries in every field. They pay in some of the fields very high salaries. In Israel, we pay everybody the same. So by definition, it's in these areas where the salaries are much higher in the States than in other fields, you're going to get these huge gaps. And so what we see is that the brain drain from the universities is focused a lot in these areas where there are big salary differences. It's not the only reason. In the life sciences, for example, you need a serious lab to work in, and you need basically the ability to conduct research. And if you don't have that kind of ability, that alone is a reason not to remain in Israel and go where somebody gives you a lab to work with. So the reasons can differ from place to place. The overall reason, I would say, is that there are the salary issues, but there is the Israel issue, okay, which is not just for university professors. What kind of schools do my kids go to? All right, and if the schools are really crummy, and they're not just crummy for the Arabs and the Haredim, they're not very good in general. I didn't show you the data for the kids who are doing well. The number of kids who excel in Israel, the share of children is very low compared to the other OECD or for the other developed world countries. The quality of education is poor. The quality of healthcare is poor. Again, we have high caliber physicians and nurses, but not enough. And we have very congested hospitals. We have the highest congestion rates in the developed world. And the lines, I mean, if I had the flu last week, so I tried to make an appointment with a physician. The next appointment is 3.5 weeks down the road, okay? So I'm gonna be either well or dead by the time I can see the doctor. And so there are these issues, congestion on the roads. We once had the same number of vehicles per kilometer road as the small European countries 50 years ago. Today we have 3 times the congestion, even though we have 40% less vehicles per capita, because nobody invested where most of the people live in either alternatives to roads, like public transportation or roads. So this quality of life issues where, again, we live longer, we have lower mortality rates, as I showed you earlier, the infant mortality. But if you look at mortality for infectious diseases, it doubled in the past 20 years, pre-corona. And the number of Israelis who die from infectious diseases is 70% more than the #2 developed world country. And which is on a scale of, if about 350 people are killed each year in traffic accidents, this is 6,000 to 7,000 people die each year just from infectious diseases. You go into the hospital with a broken leg and you come out in a coffin because you picked up some disease. And it's just an unparalleled rates compared to the developed world. So these are quality of life issues. Choose which one matters to you most, but there are a lot of issues here that are driving more and more of the young people, the 20 and 30-year-olds who have options abroad to leave.
Thank you. So I think we're nearing our time. I'll ask another, bring up another questions from the Q&A. This is by Elaine Copeland, who seems to, says that she agrees with your opinion, but is very pessimistic regarding the ability of Israel in dealing with the Haredim. She says, I felt for many years that Israel may not exist in 100 years, another 100 years, but now mostly because of the, the Haredi population. So can any change be achieved given the political system of 25 different political parties make the appropriate changes to the current system. That this is her question, and I think she's right. I also think that the last person that really kind of was outspoken about the Haredi population is actually Yair Lapid's father, right, Tommy Lapid, and since then things were kind of have been quiet.
Well, again, it's kind of the prisoner's dilemma. Who wants to take them on if you may need them as partners after the next election? Having said that,
did you talk to the Haredi leaders? I mean, we saw photos of you with Bennett and Lapid. Did you have?
I can show you photos with Shas and with others as well. But they're very cynical. I mean, they just they want to maintain their hold on power. That's all they care about. And the way that they can convince their electorate that they're working for them is to show the money flow, because their electorate doesn't know that they could have studied something as a child and then had options to work afterwards. So they end up poor as adults. You're poor, you need help. You need a lot of help. And if you have 7 children on average, then you're going to need super amount of help. And so who brings you this help? The ones who basically deprived you of the ability to get it in the first place, but you don't see that because you don't see the fact that they deprived you of it. All you see is the fact that they need to remain in power so that we can continue to get the money. Having said that, again, the people who lead Israel know this stuff well. We've seen them, we talk with them. We continue the conversation. Right before Rosh Hashanah, we met with the Director General of the Prime Minister's office at the Prime Minister's office and the Director General of the alternate Prime Minister together with the Council of Economic Advisors. Look, these are the things you need to focus on. All the rest is noise. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we need to deal with in Israel. There are a few things that if we don't deal with now, this may be the last exit on our highway to hell, because you guys have an opportunity here.
Right. So how do you, introduce this policy not as a sort of divisive and finger pointing stream of ideas, and really as more of a holistic, positive, and a more holistic positive package? Did you have a kind of?
Well, everything I showed you here, there's pretty much agreement between Bennett and Lapid and Lieberman and Gidon Saar. Right. And they have no problem with what I just showed you here. They're in agreement because it's the right thing. How can anyone argue with the fact giving people a good education helps with the poverty, helps with inequality, you grow faster, it's a win-win. I mean, it's the right thing to do. The problem, in fact, is not even with the Haredim. Most of the Haredim would not want to live in poverty, okay? And you can see increasing numbers that actually do go work, but they don't have the skills to work in a modern economy. Increasing numbers, you saw them, I showed them, that want a higher education, okay? But they don't have the skills or the education to make it there. There are, and by the way, they have the smartphone, which enables them to overcome the ability of their leaders to minimize their contact with the outside world. They still force them. They have what are absurdly called kosher phones, because it's the opposite of kosher, which basically is like communist China. It limits their ability to enter all kinds of websites. But most of the young Haredim have 2 phones, the official phone and the other phone, which in the privacy, their own privacy of their homes, their friends, family, they open up and they can see the world. I think most of the Haredim would be receptive if we just start dealing with their leaders who care very little about the Haredim. And we need to start worrying about the Haredim because they're a part of us. They're brothers. We need to deal with this. Let them remain Haredim. No one has a problem with the remaining Haredim. They have to receive the tools to work in a modern economy, and they have to receive them tomorrow morning. And we don't have to import it from anywhere. We still have some of the best universities in the world. The knowledge is still in Israel. We just need to open up the stopgaps. It's got to reach them. It's got to reach them tomorrow morning. It's on us.
Thank you. This is before we end. I want to ask one last question. I've been to Israel in this. I just visited Israel in summer. I have my family's there, my friends, and it seems like it's booming. I mean, high rises pop up like mushrooms. People drive brand new spanking cars. A friend of mine just made what we call an exit. Right, is a high tech company got bought for a lot of money. I mean, people are euphoric, and then there's the new government, so things look good on the surface. Even with with COVID that you mentioned, I mean, we weren't the best, but we did kind of soldier through, even though we have many issues with the health. Israel has many issues with the health system. I mean, maybe I'm just saying maybe that mantra of "Yeh beseder," like things will be all right, is kind of working for Israel. You know, maybe it will be okay in the long run in the economic front. I mean, so where, yeah, how do you feel about that? Is it really a bleak future, or is there a chance that things will be all right?
Remember exponential functions? It looks good until it blows up in your face, okay? We, or the Abba Ibn quotation, we spent money like crazy in the 70s and 80s, like there was no tomorrow. And we reached hyperinflation. The entire economy was about to collapse in our face, okay? You ever said that you can't touch these guys, you can't touch these guys, everything is indexed. It's gonna be like that forever until you can't, something's gotta give. And it gave. In 1984, we got our act together and we fixed it. In fact, we fixed it in the textbook way that's copied by other countries, and how to tame hyperinflation and bring it down to normal levels really quickly. When we get our act together, no holds bar. We were pretty ruthless about it, in fact, because things that we could have done nicely when we had a chance, when we don't have a chance, we just do it in a roughshod manner. We did it in the Intifada when I showed you the turnaround, okay? The country was just caving basically in terms of economy. Money's flowing out. We reached 5 shekels to the dollar, 4.99 in June 2002, basically on the verge of collapse. And then we got it together. We clamped down where we needed to clamp down. We stopped giving money out to everybody, including coalition partners like the Haredim, but not just. And we fixed it. We dealt with it. This is what we do. The problem with everything I just showed you, it's a lot more insidious because of the exponential function aspect. There are things that if we don't reach the children tomorrow, when they're adults, there is no reset for adults. Have them become children and study the material. Once they're adults, it's too late. Game over, because then you cannot deal with that many adults in terms of giving them the welfare needs, in terms of the hospital needs, and so on. And in terms of our, basically, if you have 20% that's already paying 93% of all the income tax, who's also going to the army, basically coming out of that group and a few of the deciles below, but basically less than half the children today serve in the army, even though it's mandatory, okay? How long can we keep this up? And by the time we understand that we can't, people are gonna make their own individual decisions. The old guys are stuck, they're gonna stay here. But the young guys, the ones that are 20 and 30, I can see it among my students. They say, fix the country, and then we'll decide if we want to come back. And you probably see 1 or 2 Israelis in Florida, maybe 3. You know, so you may have an idea of what I'm talking about here. This is not, you cannot shame Israelis into remaining in Israel anymore. It doesn't work. This has to be a country where our children and grandchildren want to live in. And that means we need to fix it. We need to fix it now before they leave, because if they leave, game over. But, you know, at some point, there's, like I said, a democratic point of no return. After that, it's just a matter of time until things collapse.
Well, thank you, Professor Ben David. I do hope that things will, you know, Yeba said that one way or another, hopefully through policy and change and not through sheer luck. Again, I want to thank Professor Dani Ben David. I know there are a few questions left up on the board, but we're already kind of running out of time. So thank you very much, Professor Dan Ben David. Thanks to the Jewish Studies Center here at the University of Florida. Thank you for Mr. Eli Glazer for co-sponsoring the event, and also the Jewish Council of North Central Florida. Thank you, Cynthia. As well. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap this up, Cynthia, or we good? So thank you. This has been an excellent discussion. I do hope that the question that were left and on the board could be answered later on after we finish this event. But again, thank you so much. I hope everybody have a good rest of your weekend. Thank you for Professor Ben David for this enlightening talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.